Hello, everyone, and welcome or welcome back to the Symposium on the impact of COVID-19 on arts professionals. We have 3 more papers this afternoon in my time, and it's a pleasure to first of all introduce Altenmüller to speak with us about studying music during the coronavirus pandemic. Eckhart, over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the kind presentation and introduction. I would like to present you some work we have done together with our Institute of Communication Sciences and Journalism. That's Magdalena Rosse, the doctoral student, and Eva Baumann, the professor. And we, since a couple of years, we conduct every semester a health survey with our students. And now we did this also during Corona times. And so I would like to see how students worked during Corona and what their issues were. So I start with how students think about the pandemic now in retrospect. Then I will present our Corona questionnaire, and then I present the results concerning health, well-being, and practicing, and then a summary. Well, we had an informal meeting with the whole group of students, and we just did a brainstorming about the question, what has Corona done with us? And I'm sure you have heard a lot already this morning. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend the first part of this session because I had my own dystonia session on another stream. So, of course, most of the students were reporting about increased anxiety and stress, also loneliness, which is for music students an important issue. Then the loss of meaningfulness. As you probably know, in Germany, all concert halls, all chamber music halls closed down, and all the concerts were cancelled, and they were cancelled even up to nowadays. So still today we don't have normal concert performances. We have now, it's taking again up, but it was very difficult. So our students, of course, were asking themselves, why do I study music? Will I have a chance to make an audition in an orchestra and so on? So this was a very big issue in our student group. Then, of course, they were worrying about the studies because they know it's the most precious time in their life. These 4 years of bachelor and 2 years of master study with some very eminent instrumental teachers. And so they were really worrying about, will I have a chance in comparison to those who were trained before or after Corona? Because, of course, 1 year of proper teaching was somehow lost in some way. Then, of course, worries about families, about the fathers, parents, grandparents, and so on. And then that's a thing, maybe you have also realized this, Germany is very special in Corona. We have this kind of what we call Querdenker. So there's a group, it's a small group, but a very loud group, which are just neglecting Corona, which are against the so-called Corona dictatorship of Angela Merkel, our chancellor. And so there was the climate in the society was, we have a German word for this, it's Dünnhäutigkeit. There was this kind of thin-skinnedness, and there was a lot of irritation and microaggressions. Just to give you an example, I commute in a so-called local train, and they have these small compartments, and usually there can be 2 people in one compartment, and during Corona. And when I entered a compartment and somebody is already in, this lady stood up and very briskly, just without taking eye contact, ran out of the compartment, just to somehow show that she was very irritated that I was entering as a second allowed person the compartment. So this kind of microaggressions, which we have observed all over society in all the contexts. And this was something which in some way made us so tired of Corona. But as you know, we are mostly very optimistic, and Angela Merkel coined in response to the fugitives, to the refugees, the famous sentence, we will make it, wir schaffen das. So what we did at that time, I was vice president of my university, and I was in charge, since I'm a medical doctor, I'm a neurologist and a flute player and an artist. I was in charge of organizing the whole Corona measures at our university. So we had a complete closure of our university from March 15 to May 7. This was not long. This is 7 weeks. That was not a lot, and it was mostly the semester break, which is also very good. Then we had from May 8 until June 15, we had a reopening for individual face-to-face music lessons on the basis of strict hygiene rules, all these so-called contact controls and so on and so on. You know all of this. The point was, it was depending on the voluntariness of the teachers. So some teachers didn't want to come, they were afraid, or they were lazy, or they were just staying with their families somewhere outside Europe, or somewhere couldn't come to Hanover. But this was still, there was already some kind of a little bit normality starting. Most of the teachers at that time taught via Zoom, which is a huge problem in terms of acoustic transmission, as you probably know, because the adaptation on the different volumes and so on of the instruments is not possible. From June 16 on in last year, we had allowed group assemblies. We could play a string quartet with 1 teacher and 4 students. However, again, it was voluntarily. And then we had we do always at the end of the semester, we do our questionnaires, and we did this between July 6 and July 27. These are the data I'm reporting. How did it continue in Hanover? So from the September on, we had reduced group size, we had no concerts, the exams were under strict hygiene rules, and we were still able to have face-to-face instrumental lessons. That was nice. However, again, it was based on the voluntariness of the teachers, and this is until now. So unfortunately, our president did not follow my advice to make it now mandatory that professors are present. Still, if they don't feel somehow safe to come by plane from Israel or from Moscow to teach our students, although they are paid by us, they are still, we cannot force them to attend in person. That's a problem. We try to do presence mandatory, but as you know, it's very difficult to get this really for all persons. So the problems are mainly international professors with travel restrictions, then the bad quality of audio transmission via Zoom, frequently little affinity to technology. Some of the professors did not manage to learn how to use Zoom. It's incredible, I have to say. And then, of course, some were simply unwilling to give lectures in presence. So it turns out that I have a kind of a clinic for students with neurological and psychological distress. It turns out that some of the students which are coming from China, from Taiwan, from Japan, from Russia, haven't seen in person their professors since February 2020. That's a real problem. And I'm very much in favor of regaining normality. So what did we do? There was a general psychological overcommitment of professors and students. And what did we then do? We do a questionnaire, and it's each semester distributed to students of our music university. It has started in 2017, and it's mainly about the development of health issues. It addresses health, well-being, health behavior, practice behavior, and knowledge about health promoting measures. So we offer a very broad range of health promoting offers. For instance, we have yoga courses, we have Feldenkrais and Alexander technique courses. It's all free for the students. We also have courses on mental training, auditions training. We have psychological counseling, which is free. And we have, of course, physiotherapy, which is not free. They have to be referred from a doctor to have this here. Okay. We additionally added questions then about the corona pandemic, and that's what I will talk today. And we had 80 students. The response rate was 51%. So it was restricted to the performance major, bachelor, and the music education majors bachelor. That means we have not the master students, and we did not include those students who are not regularly practicing musical instruments. For instance, we have the Department of Communication Research, and we have other departments where the students do not regularly play their instruments. So we just included the performance major, and a response rate of 51% is relatively normal in our case, because many of the students are international students. So this questionnaire is in English and in German, but especially the international students are very reluctant to fill in this kind of questionnaires. So they just, I have to say it's rewarded. So they get 10 euro if they fill it in. So I distribute because I want to have as many responses as possible. But even this they didn't do. So the instruments, of course, are as we have a strong wind classes, so brass and woodwinds. We have strong piano classes. We have I see it's we have violins 26%. It's missing the violins. Never mind. So it's just the usual distribution you have in music universities. The vocal fields are usually more represented, and this is a little bit underrepresented with 7% here. So we first ask in our questionnaire, did you have corona? And these are the good news. So in the first half year, we almost had no confirmed corona infection at our university, which is very, very good. I have one student who got infected he did a placement in an opera in Osnabrück, where he was singing in Don Giovanni, I think Leporello. And he acquired there in the theater, he acquired corona. And he unfortunately also had a kind of long COVID syndrome with breath problems and singing problems until last winter time. So that was something which was longer. But you can see, so most of the students were not infected and stayed healthy in this first half year of corona. Then very little belong to risk group. As you probably know, in music students, most of them are in very good health because of course, they have to perform in a regular way and they have to do an entrance examination. And so the health status of music students is usually better than, for instance, of law or psychology students. And then some of them, about 1/4 or 1/5, lived with someone who belonged to a risk group. This is just something we were asking here. They were also thinking whether they get infected, did they have a lot of contact and so on, and they also the anxieties about the severity of an infection, and you can see now here, so 2.5 would be, I'm indifferent for this. So here we have mostly no major issues and concerns about being afraid of getting infected or believing that I will be very seriously infected. Now, we have compared now the data with our previous data, and it turns out that compared to before the pandemic, the students had almost the same percentage of pain problems. So pain is the most prevalent medical problem you can assess in medical school. So 2.5 would be, 3 would be no change. And you see, though, some have less pain and mostly they have in tendency less pain. Why do they have less pain? Because of course they practice a little bit less as before. This is something, and they have less stresses. That means they have less performances, they have less exams, and they have less public appearances. Then in terms of the mental state, this was the issue which was indeed changed and worsened. So you see here they have more worrying thoughts and feelings. And this was true for both for the performance majors as well as for the music education majors, as you can see. So it's not a huge change. You would say 3 was no change and 3.9, but there is a clear change. Interesting is that the symptoms of depression and anxiety were even a little bit less than before Corona. And this hints towards a kind of performance and exam-based anxiety problem. So students are very much worrying about the results of the exams and about their performance. And since we didn't have performances, they had less reasons to worry. I found this interesting. So now if we go to the daily practicing hour, we see the practice before the pandemic in the average 3.2 hours a day for the performance majors and a little bit less, 2.5 for the music education majors. You have to think that we average this over 7 days. So that means even if they take a day free off, they take another day then with 6 hours of practicing. So the 3.2 hours is quite common also in the UK and also in the American music universities for the performance majors. Of course, there are a lot of differences in the instrument. I could go into this. So the most practicing instrumentalists are usually the piano players and the guitar players, and the least one are the singers. This has, of course, to do also with the bodily demands of this kind of activity. So this was before, and they changed a little bit. So change in daily practicing hours, as you can see now here, in comparison to the pandemic, increased 39% of the performance and 28% of the educational. So about a little bit more than a third of the performance practiced more, and about a fourth practiced less. So this is just something which we found this interesting. There is a reason why they do not practice. So the reason for increase in daily practice, of course, is they had more time and they were staying with their parents and they had the instruments at house. They had good instruments at home, for instance, grand pianos or things like this. And they also were able to practice independently from the lessons and were able to concentrate better because they were not distracted by socializing and so on and so on. They could even, some of them could even motivate better. For the reasons why they practice less, you see many of them were less motivated. Many did not have access to the rehearsal room. So this is, for example, this is, for example, important for the piano students. Some of them do not have a piano in their private apartment, and it's for the percussion instrument also. The percussionists and the harp players, they have the harps in the music university, and this was closed, or it was difficult to have access, or it was not allowed to practice more than 2 hours a week. We had a rule, a schedule where the students could come during the Corona times to practice 2 hours per week. This was just to be just and divide the practice time for all students in the just way. So this is interesting here. The loss of earnings was another point. So as you know, most of the students in our place were need to earn some money by playing concerts or by doing side jobs like serving in a restaurant and so on. And you see, of course, this was an issue for many of the students, especially if they were dependent on this kind of incomes and had parents which were not able to support them really. So real distress, only 19%. That's also important because we had a lot of measures to help them financially. I will come to this later. Digital performance, no role, 10%, 12%, nothing really important. So they did not really benefit from this. That has also to do with expensive equipment, and some of them didn't have the equipment, and also they were very much reluctant to perform digitally because they feel that they were not artistically far enough advanced to put something in YouTube or somewhere where it can be then seen for the next 40 years. So this is another point. The students are very responsible about what they will put on upload, for instance, in a digital format. And then finally, the measures we have taken from the presidential board are excellently. The students were very much, they felt very well and very safe in our university. That was a very good mark we got from our students. I come to the end. So the impression is, and I think you will agree if you think about the lectures you have heard this morning, that the music students cope better than most other students with the pandemic. And I think making music, even in private alone, in kind of lockdown, is a resource for many of the students. Generally, students practiced a little bit less, and generally also students had an increase of stressful thoughts and feelings. We had extremely generous financial aid. So the Ernst von Siemens Stiftung simply gave us 250,000 euro to have a quick support for music students who had no income from side jobs or from concerts. So this is for our, so we have performing students altogether about 600. This was very, very helpful and extremely useful. So it improved the situation a lot. Students who were psychologically unstable before the pandemic, they had hard times, and the isolation and the lack of structure worsened depressions. I have seen this in my clinic a lot, and this is something we have now very good routines, and it's now on a very good way to overcome this kind of Corona-induced depression. And then finally, my personal observation. So many of the students somehow did very creative joint videos, chamber music videos, where they were playing at different places of Europe, and also very funny videos. And this was an extremely important resource. Also, some of our students, I did a large study together with the university, with the Max Planck Institute in Göttingen about aerosols. Here you see one of our trumpet students who is going to probe how many aerosols she is distributing with her trumpet. And you can see this was something the students were extremely motivated to come and follow and just do measurements. They try somehow to cope also with the pandemic in terms of scientific interest and critical thinking about the measures the state of Germany and also the Board of Presidents in our university has taken. And I think this is what I have to communicate to you. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Eckhart. A really fascinating insight into how it was for these students. Are there questions or comments from the audience, please? Oh yeah, hi, Hara.
Hello everyone. Hello Eckhart.
Hello.
Nice to see you again. It's Hara from London. I think you portrayed a rather positive aspect of things, and I was expecting the opposite. So you caught me by surprise here. So I think that's a very good sign. Certainly, I don't deal with the music students directly, other than in the clinic that we do at the BAPAM clinics. And I have to say that perhaps other than some physical ailments in terms of, you know, bad practice patterns and things like that were occurring at home without the supervision of the teacher, the student population, the music student population coped much better than our students, for instance, in medical school and other sort of disciplines. So I just wanted to say that you surprised me. You surprised me.
I absolutely think that the students here are especially positive thinking young people. And I think if you have this enthusiasm and the music, it might be a huge help in these very difficult times. The point which was very important and which is reflected not in my data is about 1/3 of the students were thinking about studying another topic. They were thinking of switching the field. They were not really discussing it aloud, but I had a lot of students here just counseling. What do you think? Should I study medicine? Should I study psychology? Should I study something else? Or should I? And that is something, the doubts, they were extremely clear. But they had a constructive approach to this. They were just openly discussing it with me. The point in our, I mean, I have to say in the politics in Germany, and I think worldwide, it was that culture was really neglected. I mean, the culture, I mean, the soccer states were open already in summer last year. And for singing, the dangerous singing, my God, singing. Even nowadays, if I go to the huge cathedral in Hanover, we have to have 3 meter distance each other and wearing mask and having 3G. It's awful, it's awful. So I think this is something, we have a societal loss in kind of trust into the solidarity with respect to the culture.
And certainly you can see a difference between the student musician and the professional musician.
Absolutely.
Of course,
yeah.
You know, the loss of earnings and performances was a big issue in their life. Yeah, thank you so much.
May I just jump in with one question about the practicing time and that being a little less during the pandemic? You may not know this, but have you seen that sort of reverting back, or do you think there might be a new sort of attitude towards practice now from the students?
No, it's reverting back, and in the contrary, there are now, every week I have about 6 to 7 students with overuse. They jumped into the normal workload without a proper bodily preparation. And that's a very common, by the way, that also happens to the professional orchestral players.
Thank you. Which links very nicely to our next presentation. So please join me in thanking Eckhart very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the questions also. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take just a couple of minutes for a short break and a handover. Thank you. Just while we're waiting, I think I may have forgotten, my apologies, to say at the beginning that these sessions are being recorded for ISPS delegates only, so they're going to be made available for delegates for a week, I believe. But just to let you know that that is happening.
It's always good to have a break.
Wonderful. So we're at time, so we'll continue with the symposium on the impact of COVID on arts professionals. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Susanna Cohen, presenting with Professor Jane Ginsburg, speaking to us around the impact of COVID on freelance orchestral musicians. So Susanna, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to present the preliminary findings of this follow-up project, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the lives of self-employed orchestral musicians in the UK, a year after we carried out an initial set of interviews during the first lockdown in the summer of 2020. So before describing the findings of this follow-up, I'd just like to set the scene and provide a little background about the UK music scene. On March the 23rd, 2020, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced the start of the first UK lockdown, which brought immediate and drastic disruption to the UK performing arts industry, with the cancellation of nearly all live performing arts events. Now, prior to the drastic disruption caused by COVID-19, the UK music industry contributed 5.8 billion to the economy, employing just under 200,000 people. Now, in the UK, unlike in Europe, where most of the orchestral musicians are salaried, only 8% of the UK's 14,000 professional orchestral musicians are salaried, for example, in orchestras like the BBC and the regional orchestras. 7% have positions as self-employed members of orchestras like the London Symphony Orchestra and the Philharmonia, and the remaining 85% are self-employed freelance players who create portfolio careers comprising a mixture of orchestral, theatre, chamber music, and commercial recording work, as well as teaching. Now, the literature has shown that musicians tend to be passionate about their work. Their sense of self is often tightly bound up with their playing, and involuntary career changes have been found to pose a threat to musicians' well-being. So if one adds to this the evidence of the negative impact that COVID-19 has had on mental health, and evidence that self-employed workers tend to experience anxiety about job insecurity, one can see that freelance musicians might be very vulnerable at this time. So lifespan models of professional musicians' careers suggest that musicians tend to have great professional longevity, and that an adult professional musician's working life can be divided up into 3 stages during which there's a shift in focus. So the early career stage is characterized by the search for employment. The mid-career stage is regarded as the period of greatest performing activity and the greatest achievements. The late career stage is described as a period when there's a greater focus on acknowledging one's achievements and teaching and passing on skills. So we thought that musicians at different stages of their careers might be likely to experience this period of career disruption in different ways. So that brings us on to the first study. So in this first study, we looked at the experiences of mid-career and seasoned freelance orchestral musicians during the first UK lockdown, and we asked, how have freelance orchestral musicians been experiencing this time, and what are the similarities and differences in the experiences of mid-career and seasoned musicians? These participants were recruited through posts on Facebook and social media, and I interviewed 12 mid-career and 12 seasoned professional orchestral musicians on single recorded Zoom interviews, which were then transcribed verbatim and analysed using thematic analysis in the steps described by Braun and Clark. So I'm going to provide a very, very brief summary of the findings of this first study. We found that all 24 participants reported the loss of a much-loved successful career and were experiencing anxiety about the future. However, there were some differences between the 2 groups. The mid-career participants were much more anxious about money, they were more confused about their identity as musicians and about their future careers, and they were much more distressed. They were also less engaged in music making, enjoying the little music making that they were doing, much less, and they demonstrated less resilience than their older seasoned colleagues. So all in all, they presented a picture of a group of workers, of mid-career musicians in crisis. So by comparison, the seasoned musicians had a sense that they'd already achieved a lot in their careers. Many were focused on the teaching and helping their students, and all in all, they were less distressed about money and demonstrated greater emotional and financial resilience. So if you're interested, do have a look at the paper online, because it it paints a very challenging picture of the difficult reality that these previously successful freelance musicians had to face. So that brings us onto the current study, in which we aimed to explore the impact of COVID-19 on these musicians over the longer term. So for our method, all of the 24 original study participants were invited by email and Facebook by Messenger to take part in a single Zoom interview during the summer of 2021. We've so far carried out preliminary thematic analysis of 12 of the verbatim transcripts, which I'm going to present some of the preliminary findings of that analysis today. So we managed to carry out single Zoom interviews with 21 of the 24 participants, all 12 of the mid-career players and 9 of the seasoned players. Of the 3 seasoned players who didn't participate, one emailed back that she had gone into full-time teaching, and even though I still tried to pursue her with emails, she didn't respond. One wrote back that he was having neck and back problems and currently unable to sit in front of a computer, and the final participant completely disappeared and didn't respond to anything at all. Very briefly, none of the 21 participants had so far decided to give up their performing careers, whereas in the first study, 11 of the 12 mid-career players had reported considering leaving the profession. However, in this follow-up study, it seemed to be the oldest seasoned players, those players who were over the age of 65, who were the most full of doubts about their future performing careers, and we'll talk more about this later. So now let's have a quick look at the preliminary thematic analysis of 12 of the interview transcripts. So 7 of these were mid-career players and 5 were seasoned musicians. Uncertainty of future freelancing career was identified as the dominant theme, and we identified 3 further overarching themes: returning to performing, maintaining well-being, and growth. And 2 further latent themes were also identified: awareness of others and being a self-motivated learner. And we're now going to whiz through looking at each of these themes in turn. So the dominant theme, uncertainty of future freelancing career, was present in all of the interviews, and it encompassed 4 sub-themes: anxiety about the fragility of freelance work, coping with cancellations, the question of how to make money when unable to earn money from performance, and maintaining identity as a musician. All except 2 players reported still having barely any freelance performing work, and players expressed a lot of anxiety about the fragility of freelancing. One mid-career string player reported that the fees for a West End show where he'd recently worked had actually gone down since the pandemic. He said, "In these times, beggars can't be choosers. So obviously I show up, smile my best smile, and play as well as I can. What is a shame is that behind every freelance musician is another even more desperate musician willing to step up at any moment to work for practically nothing." And many participants expressed concerns about the future of touring. As one seasoned woodwind player put it, "I think the combination of Brexit and COVID has absolutely knocked the whole of foreign touring on the head." One player with EU citizenship said about contemplating leaving the UK to try and get some salaried playing and teaching work in in Europe. "It's not that I want to. I don't want to. I love living where I am, and I love the work that I used to have. But it's this complete loss of trust in my employers over this last year, and that's been the main effect of COVID." And this brings us onto the subject of work cancellations. All of the players talked about the difficulty of dealing with often last-minute cancellations. One mid-career string player said, "Those are the only concerts I've got. I've got nothing else. It feels like a much bigger deal if it's cancelled, partly because of the money, but also just the wanting to play and wanting to perform and wanting to do all that stuff. It just feels like a kick in the teeth." And a mid-career brass player complained bitterly of the loyalty expected of her as the principal player of a freelance orchestra, where she was expected to commit to playing 70% of the programs. But this loyalty wasn't reciprocated by the orchestral management, who would send last-minute impersonal emails cancelling all of her work because of last-minute program changes. She said, "I've put in all the work to be prepared, and then the orchestra have just turned around and said, 'Oh, sorry, we're changing the programme. It's just devastating not being part of it. I rang the management and I cried on the phone and I said, this cannot be. You've cancelled all of our work. What are we meant to do? How are we meant to survive? So this brings us onto the question of how these musicians made money when they were unable to earn a living from performing. The UK government's self-employment grants helped 2/3 of the 24 participants. However, that left 8 players who were not eligible for grants, and this reflects the Musicians Union's figure of 38% in their larger survey. 17 of the 21 players had earned money by taking on more teaching. Most were very appreciative of their teaching, both for providing income and also for allowing them to continue to work in the field. However, some of the participants were not enjoying doing all this teaching, and one mid-career player said, I'm very fortunate in that I'm working pretty much full-time, but it's all teaching, which is not what I want to be doing. I don't really like it very much. And of those mid-career players who had to find work out of music, one mid-career string player said about working in a local cafe during the summer of 2020, I had to bite my tongue and just do it because that's what needed to be done, she said. But she carried on, this is not what I'm supposed to be doing. You know, by the time you get to your mid-40s, it felt just sort of personally, it felt like I'd taken a huge, not even a step, but a huge leap backwards. You know, this was not the sort of job that you do now. I did this sort of work when I was a student. 3 other mid-career musicians described having worked as couriers. And one mid-career player had set up a new business during this time, a distillery, and other players had also developed new avenues. And we'll talk about that more when we talk about a section on growth. As mentioned, in this follow-up study, it was the oldest seasoned players, not the mid-career players, who were the most confused about their professional identity. A seasoned string player with over 40 years of professional performing experience said, it's been difficult to hang on to the idea that I'm a professional musician, quite honestly. Whereas in contrast, a mid-career violinist said, I mean, I couldn't not play the violin. It's what I do. It's very clear that I would never stop. However, nearly all of the players were still engaged in regular practice despite the lack of performing opportunities. A seasoned wind player said, I can't say I enjoy it very much at the moment. I mean, I do it because that's what you do. It's like you brush your teeth in the morning. It's unthinkable not to play. And others described practicing in order to be in shape when they got back to work or in order to be able to demonstrate to students. Several mid-career players had set up online recitals in order to provide them with an incentive to continue to practice. One had joined a supportive peer group of musicians and they were all accountable to each other about whether or not they practice. But it was some of the oldest musicians who described really struggling to motivate themselves to practice when there were no concerts. And one said, I'm finding it really quite difficult at the moment with the ongoing uncertainty. It's very hard to motivate myself, actually. So on to the overarching themes. This comprised the sub-themes, love of music, apprehensions about returning to playing, online streaming, and working in a COVID-safe environment. Many of the players spoke emotionally about returning to playing after a long COVID-enforced break. One mid-career string player said, it was incredibly emotional. There are a lot of us just bawling our eyes out all the time. I still feel a bit goosebumpy even talking about it now. It was just really, really wonderful. Many of the players expressed a variety of apprehensions about returning to work. A mid-career string player said, walking back in there, I felt sick, I felt nervous. Sounds a bit strange, but I felt nervous seeing colleagues again after such a long time. And one mid-career brass player described the stress of dealing with the logistics of freelancing. There was a session I was very, very, very nearly late for because I'd just forgotten the time it takes. I hadn't left enough time. Most players described preparing for going back to work by practicing the music in advance, which they wouldn't necessarily have done before. And although some players had enjoyed performing online, others found the whole process of dealing with online streaming absolutely fraught. And while some described the difficulty of playing socially distanced, others commented that it was really not a problem. And what many players described as terrible for them was that the lack of social life. One said, what's really awful is there's no social life. I mean, you can't go to the canteen and have a cup of tea and a biscuit in the break. You just sit there in dead silence in the studio. And, you know, it's a really horrible experience. The second overarching theme was maintaining well-being, and participants commented that the past year had been full of emotional ups and downs. However, others reported feeling more relaxed because of not having to deal with the stress of playing and being out and about freelancing. Participants reported using a rich variety of strategies and resources for helping to maintain their well-being, including using support networks of family and friends and using a wide range of cognitive strategies. Many reported having the time to engage in regular exercise and consequently being fitter than they were before the pandemic, although others complained of having backache from spending so much time teaching in front of the computer screen. And in terms of eating and drinking habits, many had put on weight and many had actually reduced their drinking now that they were no longer meeting with friends after a concert. Players used a lot of routines to help them structure their lives, and some mid-career players had really enjoyed that. One said, we were like a normal family with a normal job. We'd be in every evening, eating together. The third overarching theme identified was growth, comprising the sub-themes, development of new opportunities and skills, resilience and resourcefulness, and insights. Now, the participants developed many new skills and developed new avenues during this period. And this included working in music editing and publishing, doing a TEFL course and moving abroad, developing an online business, selling paintings. Two had decided to start working and doing courses on using music therapeutically, and one had actually started off a new business making fine gins and vodkas. And all of the musicians expressed the hope that they'd be able to combine these new interests with performing as it began to slowly return. So this creates an overall picture of great resourcefulness, which was very different from the picture a year ago, when particularly the mid-career players were really in a state of disarray and reeling from the sudden disintegration of their much loved and hard worked for careers. Of the many new insights gained during this time, one mid-career musician said, "This lockdown has been the equivalent of being locked in a padded cell, so you are really shut away with your own thinking. I recognized that something in me had to change. It's been a time of working through my emotional issues, and also to have a sense of what my motives were for being a musician." And among the seasoned players, insights were more focused on the possibility of having had enough of performing and maybe being ready to stop. An older seasoned woodwind player said, "I feel I've done it, and so it's not like I'm itching to get back to it all. I think the age thing is very important. It depends what part of your career you're at. And if my career is a crescendo to forte and a diminuendo to pianissimo, I've reached about piano dolce on the way down." So there were two latent themes: awareness and concern for others, and being an intrinsically motivated self-learner. As in the first study, awareness and concern for others shone through in every interview, particularly concern for younger players. And this awareness and empathy for others might reflect the acute listening and communication skills that are an essential part of the orchestral musician's toolkit, allowing them to carry out their everyday work of making music together. And that being a self-motivated learner has been found to be associated with being a successful musician. And we can see with these players' motivation to develop new activities and to continue practicing that they are indeed highly motivated. So very, very briefly, that's the full model of the preliminary findings at this stage, but that may of course change. And the next stage will be for us to examine the findings in terms of resilience and post-traumatic growth. So in the original study, we found the mid-career participants were distressed, confused, and overwhelmed by the loss of their profession. And the seasoned participants appeared to be much more emotionally and financially resilient. However, The follow-up study suggests that this picture is not now the same, and it's being suggested that transformative positive growth and change can occur as a response to a struggle with great adversity. And the next stage in our analysis will be to look for signs of post-traumatic growth in the study participants. So these signs are the signs of post-traumatic growth are personal strength, relating to others, appreciation of life, openness to new possibilities, and spiritual change. And growth in even one or two of these realms can have a profound effect on a person's life. Given the long list of new opportunities and skills already developed by the study participants, together with the insights that they've gained, it seems very likely that there are already signs of post-traumatic growth, even though this is obviously still early days. So we'll be looking at that more closely. Implications, really, in a nutshell. So for music colleges need to train musicians to be equipped for varied portfolio careers. So being able to play your instrument really well is just not enough. Students also need to have good teaching skills, studio skills, and small business skills, so that they can have some help on learning how to manage their finances better. Music colleges would also do well to help train music colleges to become intrinsically motivated, self-regulated learners. So that's definitely food for thought. Musicians' organizations need to help in creating guidelines for orchestras and players for dealing with the terms of last-minute changes and cancellations, and to continue to provide emotional and financial support and advice, and also to advertise themselves better, because I think a lot of the players were unaware of the support that these organizations can provide. Employers, so orchestral management needs to show greater consideration and transparency about how they deal with last minute cancellations, and if there's going to be flexibility about last minute cancellations, then it needs to be reciprocal. So if an orchestra has a right to cancel a player at a short notice, then that player should also have the right to find a replacement for themselves at short notice. In conclusion, our preliminary analysis of this follow-up study suggests that the mid-career participants who were previously in crisis are now doing much, much better, with many of them showing early signs of post-traumatic growth. And it is now the oldest seasoned musicians who appear to be more troubled and less professionally certain. However, as many of the players noticed, it is still very early days, and the path of the pandemic and the future is still very uncertain. And so I very, very much hope that we can do a follow-up of the follow-up in the future to see where everyone is up to. And just before I end, I would like to say a few words about my experience of interviewing these musicians. And I do feel very privileged to have had this chance to talk with such an amazing bunch of people whose resourcefulness and empathy shone through despite the turbulence and the extreme uncertainty of this period. And I think it's important to stress that these previously successful freelance musicians do all possess a very, very rich and varied skill set. They're highly motivated, dedicated, resourceful, organized, creative, socially skilled, empathetic, and determined team players. And with the appropriate support and guidance, I am sure that these skills will be valuable and highly transferable, whatever the future may bring. And just to say thank you to the participants for being prepared to talk so openly in challenging times, and to the Royal Northern and to Help Musicians for helping to support the project. Thank you for listening. Oh, and those are the references.
Thank you so much, Susanna and Jane. Are there questions or comments from the audience? Yes, Eckhart, please.
I wanted to have the clapping hands. I took the wrong hands. I have, Susanna, a wonderful talk, and very much in line with my personal experience in my musicians clinic. Absolutely, I absolutely agree.
Thank you. We do have a question in the chat, which I'll read out from Christine. Wonderful work, Susanna. Congratulations. Thank you. I wonder if you have considered whether there are policy or advocacy implications. I don't know the details of what support freelance musicians have had in the UK, but I know there has been far more discussion here in Canada about a guaranteed basic income in regards to freelancers in all fields. Also curious about whether access to healthcare was threatened. I'm sure they maintained access to NHS services, but are there others they may have lost?
Well, I can say I can say in terms of access to the services, most of these players, it didn't occur to them to access any services. Even organizations like Help Musicians, a few accessed their they had an emergency financial grant, but in terms of getting a bit of extra help with, advice or financial advice, most of them, it didn't occur to them. And I have to say, there's this thing about that came up again and again with the freelancers. Nobody owes me anything. There's this sort of expectation of, it's up to you, and you have to be incredibly resourceful. And these players were incredibly resourceful, are incredibly resourceful. They're getting their act together. On the other hand, the government support has been dismal in terms of the number of players who slipped through the gaps. A third of our players slipped through the gaps, and in the first study we reported this. This has caused terrible distress and financial hardship. And this player who described going to work in a cafe, and she was one of 3 who worked, and one of the others, who I haven't really got down to analyze, talked about mopping up the floor of a pub. And it's like, this is what my years of skill have come to. So no, there's a real problem with the government support, and I think I didn't talk about it here, but most of them felt that they'd been absolutely neglected, and the government really didn't care about musicians. And although everyone was enjoying and loving listening to music during lockdown, and that music was helping people maintain their well-being, there was a complete lack of thought about how it was. I think it was Caitlin mentioned the Fatima advert, how it could be that the government was so clueless about what it means to become an artist, a performing artist.
Yes, Jane.
If I can just say something about guaranteed basic income, this is something that has been mooted. There are lots of people, the Labour Party is very much in favour of this, for example, but we have a government, we have a government that is utterly uninterested. We had a budget yesterday, and yeah, there's some money for theatres. Well, we had this conversation earlier on in the conversation. I wondered if there is. I wonder whether Hara would like to say something about access to healthcare services.
Yes, thank you, Jane. Actually, I was going to raise my hand in a second. It absolutely, Susanna's presentation reflects what we see down the other end. And I don't have the exact numbers with me today, but I'm sure they will come up in future symposia or meetings. BAPAM, the main organization that actually looks after these musicians, the workload for us on Zoom, of course, it was on Zoom consultations, has exponentially increased. And we see mental health issues primarily. They may present with some pain or some other symptom, but it comes down to this lack of support and lack of exposure and performing. So it has been a big issue, and resources are scarce, as Jane says. Support is very few. I think if it were not for these organizations like BAPAM or Help Musicians that Susanna worked with, we would be in a very, very difficult situation.
Thank you, everyone. I should have just asked it out loud. I just wasn't sure how things were being handled since I popped in.
Thank you, Susanna, Jane, for the presentation, and thank you for all the comments and questions. We'll take a minute or so now just to have a very short break and hand over for the third and final paper. Thank you again.
Susanna, could you just check your email? We've just had an invitation, which is so relevant to this. So we may have the opportunity to do something about influencing policy. I'm going to respond with a copy of the your presentation, if you don't mind, if I can just send the slides. Thanks. And by the way, congratulations, Rosie and Netta and everybody who's running this symposium. It's really terrific. Thank you.
Wonderful. I can see that the slides are all good to go for the third or the sixth, I suppose, paper in this symposium. I'm really delighted to introduce Philip Cartwright and Victoria Parker, speaking today around dancer self-assessment of response and adaptation to COVID-19. So welcome and thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Rosie. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to participate in this session and to speak with you today. A couple of prefacetory notes. Victoria and I have been working together now for about a year. And when Victoria first met me, I was a professor of economics at the Paris School of Business. And for a number of reasons, including wonderful support from the team at the Royal College of Music and a few other people here in Paris, and my own passions, the door opened at the sister school. So I'm now fully involved in arts and culture. So it's a late career change, but one that's very welcome, and I'm very, very happy that things have happened the way they have. This particular study was done with Emma Redding at Trinity Laban, as well as her colleague Liliana Araujo. Victoria and I did a number of interviews along the way, and I'll say again as a prefacetory note, there's a, call it a sister study that goes along with this, which was sponsored in part by the University of Chicago. And I was able to speak with a number of musicians as well as dancers and do some comparative study as between dancers and musicians. So if anybody has any questions along those lines when we're done with today's presentation, feel free to ask. I also want to give some credit up front to many musicians in New York, in particular musicians with the New York City Ballet Orchestra and the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra. There were a number of people that were quite instrumental in helping us to bridge the gap between the music community and the dance community. Today we'll be speaking specifically about the dance community, and I'm quite relieved that many of the findings that I've been hearing thus far today are entirely consistent with what we found with the professional dancers. So basically what we wanted to do is do some exploratory research by way of semi-structured interviews with professional dancers at various levels of their career with respect to the psychosocial implications of the COVID during periods of extended restrictions. And I want to point out that the study has at least two biases. One is, for the most part, it's American-based. And second of all, it's biased toward the upper end of the career ladder. That is to say, it's top-heavy with principals and soloists as opposed to members of the Corps de Ballet. We won't be mentioning any specific names with respect to responses, but I do want to recognize 9 professional dancers in particular that were extremely helpful, both during the interviews and, you know, as I indicated, I guess genetically by birth, I'm an economist, learning new things every day. And many of these people were exceptionally kind to me in allowing me not only to interview them, but actually to participate in their rehearsal sessions by way of Zoom. So every day is a new learning experience for me, and I very much enjoy that. So basically, we started with, from a theoretical point of view, we started with the discussion of identity theory, and we wanted to better understand the implications of the COVID and lockdown restrictions with respect to artist identities and the extent to which artist identities might have shifted as a consequence. Now, again, I yield to you, the distinguished participants in this session. We came across a good bit of literature which I basically indicated that there may very well be significant identity shifts which are persistent in the face of trauma. And if we allow ourselves to think of the COVID crisis and the extended lockdown, particularly in New York, you may recall that New York was a very, very troubled city for an extended period of time. So if we can at least begin to think about the COVID situation and the restrictions in light of trauma, we wanted to focus on identity and get some sense as to whether or not identity may have been shifted over a period of time. And we'll talk about some follow-up work that I would like to do along those lines. So the general perspective of identity theory provides the basis for what we were doing. And we looked very much at the individualistic consequences of the COVID and the associated lockdown. To some extent, with respect to social implications and the intermingling of the individualistic consequences with social consequences. But I have to say the primary weight was put on the individualistic consequences. So role-playing also played a significant part in our interview process. And as has been pointed out in some of the earlier remarks, I was very pleased to find the extent to which people were innovative, positive, and willing to reflect upon their relative positions and perhaps think about alternative roles for themselves in their own, relative to their own profession and relative to social roles outside their profession. And very briefly, I'll say that one of the things that a number of the professional dancers told me in interviews was that the COVID experience opened their mind to, not that they're closed-minded, but opened their mind to social issues that because of the intensity of their profession, their extensive travel and so forth, they really hadn't thought about it too much. And the two leading instances, or the two leading movements in the US that were mentioned were first and foremost the gender gap, and second of all, Black Lives Matter. I thought that was an interesting twist with respect to the social environment. We did focus on, as I said, identity. We tried to get information as concerns how people perceived themselves relative to their social situation and relative to their profession. And we wanted to get some sense for concerns that they might have had relative to turning points in their life. And, this is particularly important for principals in a dance company. I think on average, and Victoria can correct me if I'm mistaken, but the average life of a professional dancer at the level of Royal Ballet or the English National Ballet or American Ballet Theater or New York City Ballet is roughly 18 seasons. So obviously, one big difference between these dancers and the musicians is that musicians have a much longer expectancy with respect to their career trajectory. And we heard of, or know of, as a matter of fact, because of the severity of the lockdowns and the restrictions, the dance community lost people at both ends of the spectrum. That is to say, principals that were very, very close to the end of their career knew that they wouldn't be coming back. And similarly, new entrants to the Corps de Ballet were, well, as you know, the US market economy is not particularly benign, period, let alone with respect to the arts. So a number of the younger people, new entrants to the professional discipline, were in fact fired. So moving through this anyway, we also touched on people's life stories, how they got to be where they are. And needless to say, one thing that jumps out across the board is the unbelievable physical and mental commitment to their profession, and the physical aspect of it will come to the fore when I turn it over to Victoria. And I do think it's fair, in retrospect, to think about the COVID and some of the instances that occurred during the COVID restrictions and lockdown as being traumatic for some of these dancers, and I have to say, some of the musicians as well, particularly in instances where people, in a couple of instances, people in orchestral ensembles died during the course of COVID. And that, of course, had ripple effects across the organization as a whole. We did our very best to come up with something that would allow us to talk about identity. And we are aware that there are many articles, a lot of research that's been done on identity and the various axes of identity. Popoliski and Herbert have 10 classes, subjects that are related to identity. Mats Kussner and Aaron Williamson and I did a piece where we had a 7-axis framework. And all in all, at the end of the day, putting our heads together, we came up with an 8-point framework, which is neither here, it's neither here nor there. It's subject to change and comments and criticism. There's nothing carved in stone here. It just helps us to get through sorting out the content, sorting out and coding the content in the interviews, getting things into what we think are close to being the right boxes. So with that, I'll, because I have the slides, Victoria, you can tell me when you want me to flip, but.
Okay, great. I'm sorry. Anyways, this is our 8-point framework developed based on the literature review. So it analyzes what all must come together in order for somebody to kind of create their identity and who they are and what they want to be. This was also just used to kind of decide kind of where these dancers are coming from pre-COVID, what they were doing during the pandemic, as it was very difficult for them to not be in a studio. It's not similar to the other arts in that it is very complex to do it at home. A lot of people had studios installed, very tiny, obviously, in their rooms just to be able to perform bar, but center was quite difficult for them. So finding out how these impacted them during that time as well as after, which is more so when we began to speak to them and kind of got their view after they had gone through all of this. We also wanted to just make a quick note that career is not on here, although we do think it is important. It did sway the results a bit too much, especially seeing as all of these dancers are equally dedicated to their art and career. They would all kind of fall on the same axis in career. So it seemed that we were able to get more true results by disincluding that section. And next slide. So we've analyzed all of their answers and put them into 3 different types, type 1, 2, and 3. And we found that the easiest categories to categorize these dancers into was based on their company size. So we have small companies, medium companies, and large companies. And these are able to then give a small description of what the dancers in this category seem like. And that way we were able to analyze their answers post everything with these types in mind. Next slide. So for type 1, which is the small companies, we've ranked them on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the greatest amount of impact or change on their lives from the beginning or pre-COVID times to after. So these were the results from this types that are just kind of based on an average. We did have vocal interviews with them on Zoom, so this was kind of determined based on that. They were not specifically asked how they feel. This is from an outside perspective based on their answers in order to get the most genuine results. And next slide, please. This was the type 2. So this was the dancers that perform in medium companies. This kind of refers to maybe a larger city in a smaller state, as a lot of these dancers, as Phil mentioned, are based in the US, or as well as bigger companies, maybe in a smaller country. Therefore, they fell into this category as well. And these were their answers. And as you can see, these dancers took a lot of time to increase their presence on social media. One dancer in particular really talked about her new branding strategy and how she wanted to be more present on social media. And knowing her and following her, it is very clear to see the switch when she finally did have time to be able to do all of this. They also scored very highly, just like type 1, if you've noticed, in society, proximate relationships, geological and physical surroundings, and personal experience and encounters. A lot of these dancers, along with the ones in the small companies, tended to be on the younger side of our study, meaning that a lot of them had to move in with their parents or go elsewhere during this time. So a lot of these areas changed very drastically for them. And the next type, please. This was type 3. These are dancers in our larger companies. They also tended to be a bit older. As you can see, they kind of scored a lot lower compared to the other dancers in most areas, except for society, which I would say changed very greatly for everybody during this time, as we were all taken away from society for the most part and for large chunks of time. These dancers did not have as much geological change. A lot of them are in their own homes or have a developed professional and personal life, so they weren't as affected by all of these different factors. They also tended to have a better mental health about the situation. They were more accepting of it, whereas for the younger dancers, it was quite a critical time, as a lot of them just joined these companies in the last 2 to 3 years. And the next slide, please. This is just another example or another image of the same diagram for reference. And the next one, please. This is the diagram completed based on the dancer scores. They are color-coded along with the types so that you can see how each of them scored. It is very obvious that the yellow stayed on the outer edges of the diagram more because they had fewer changes in their lives. And a lot of that central area is based on the red and blue, the smaller and medium-sized companies that were impacted a lot. It really came very clear that these were the impacts. And the next slide, please. So in summary, from this diagram, we were able to figure out that all of the dancers did experience significant change during the course of COVID-19 in regards to how they were able to train and where they were even located, as well as just their societal and personal experiences with other people around them and who they were interacting with before the pandemic and now after. And we also discovered that younger dancers experienced more of a change as they were not as established in their careers, and many had to move back in with their families, which is a large adjustment from many of them living in larger or mid-sized cities. Going to their family homes that were not in these cities seemed to have a big impact on them. And thirdly, we found that media consumption and avocations varied the most among the dancers between the different types, as was dependent on how they prioritized and used their free time. A lot of them picked up different side hobbies and different things to kind of fill up their time. Many of them chose to focus on Pilates, which we found very interesting, as that is known as one of the most used cross training for dancers. But overall, these were the results that we found from that. And I'm going to turn it back over to Phil. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Directions for future research. We would like to get a better understanding of the extent to which a particular event, in this case, call it a traumatic event or near traumatic event, at time t in a given context, how might such a situation have shifted the spatial location within that identity space? And my initial thought as to how to proceed is to use a memory recall-based survey instrument, basically asking people, you recall when you first became aware of the virus, what was your immediate response? What was your response 2 weeks later, 4 weeks later, a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, whatever the time dimension might be? I have a idea as to how we might be able to go about testing the extent to which there have been these identity shifts or moves in that identity space. And I have to give credit to one of my graduate students who came to me and said, you know, you've been talking about this for a few weeks now. And I came across, she happens to be in quantitative analysis and technology. And she came to me with a very interesting model, which basically measures sentiment, but call it perspective, whatever. It would lend itself to, provided you can aggregate the data over responses, if you use Likert scales, and you could aggregate that and do some statistical analysis on it, I think you could put it into the context of this index and then use some kind of a random coefficients model or time varying coefficients model to test the stability of those coefficients over an extended period of time. And as you might guess, the problem is finding the data. But Victoria and I have a couple of ideas how we might go about that. Ideally, if we could survey one large company, like the English National Ballet, that would be nice to have some sense of homogeneity and also have enough observations that we could do some credible statistical analysis. That particular model does have 4 states. At one point, it was suggested by someone that we could use kind of a standard model of shock from the initial trauma, grief, and so forth and so on. But that has some, it was pointed out to me that that has some problems, namely those kinds of frameworks are generally directed at a trauma related to a single event, like the passing of a loved one, whereas these people experienced dislocation issues, they experienced career issues, just a number of things happened at the same time. So we wanted to be a little bit more accommodating in the framework. And I think we have something that's usable, provided we can find the respondents to do the survey work. So there are some references. And with that, I'll thank you very much and take any questions that you might have.
Thanks so much, Phil and Victoria. Are there any questions or comments? I had one thing I just wanted to quickly ask about around the sort of sizes of the different organizations and the differences you saw, and what you think the implications of that might be in terms of sort of educating dancers, thinking about tertiary higher education, and how organizations may need to respond to the information that you have here around the differences in the experiences of dancers across those organizations.
Victoria, do you want to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a lot of just personal growth and development. I think these programs should really harness those, as many of these dancers do forego a formal university education to pursue these careers from a young age. With that being said, a lot of the young dancers, specifically in this study, did actually attend a university program with a dance major or something very similar in the arts as well, before attending these programs. So I think having that background gave them a bit more structure, but also made it so that they started a little bit later. So while not a huge age difference existed in the study, it was about from 18 to 29 being our oldest dancer, there was still a lot of experiential differences in maturity that existed between the two. And I think I'm wondering if university maybe had a delay in that, being able to have that professional growth, that the dancers that forewent that opportunity or pushed it off and planned to do it later, how they were able to gain that professional experience and professional maturity at a quicker rate, and even being not that much older than the younger dancers. So it would be something interesting to look into as well.
Yeah, there were two, I'll just comment, there were two dancers that I'm thinking of, one very young and one, they're all young, I mean, relative to me anyway. So one being further along in her career. The young person came to the realization that she really lacked education. She had been dancing, she's been dancing since she was 3 years old, and had very limited exposure to not only education per se, she was homeschooled, but the social dimension of education was radically absent from her upbringing. And so she actually enrolled in UCLA to start at least a part-time college education. The other person that I'm thinking of further along in her career took the opportunity of the lockdown to go get a master's degree in arts and culture management. So depending on their academic bent, if you will, yeah, there's evidence that people are reaching out for something and often going beyond the boundaries of their experience.
Thank you. And I think we've seen that across many of the papers in these sessions. So I think this is a good time to draw this symposium to a close. To thank all of the speakers again, Eckhart, Susanna, Jane, Victoria, Philip. Thank you for all your contributions, and thank you for those who have offered questions and discussion. Thank you very much.
And thank you.
Bye everyone, hope to see you in the next few days.